Welcome and good morning, everyone. So, Mayor, I want to start just right off. Let's start with the big picture. You said that local law enforcement, the 900,000 local and state police officers, are now the tip of the spear in terms of terrorism. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, thank you. Let me start with the big picture. And I've reached out to Jane a number of times in the last couple of years to help me formulate a lot of ideas about what I'm seeing as the mayor of a major American city that I believe is a soft target, potentially for terrorism, also hosts 11 million people that comes in a year and has and continues to struggle with urban violence. That's pretty significant. And one of the things that I have noticed is that as the United States began to prosecute the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there wasn't a lot of discussion about how much it cost. You know, what is the cost of protecting the homeland? And everybody said, whatever. And so out of, whole cloth, we created the Department of Homeland Security and spent a lot of money on it, and it's doing a good job. And we spent a lot of money, can't count how much, on prosecuting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and all over the country. And I noticed in my research that tucked in defense bills was this thing called nation building. So when General Petraeus and all those guys came back, they kind of rightly said, we're fighting asymmetrical wars. If you broke it, you fixed it, according to you own it, according to Colin Powell. And we began to spend a lot of money reinvesting in schools, bridges, sewer systems, police departments. And then consequently, this not having been a new thing, we've spent a bucket load of money hiring police officers in Medellin, Colombia, to help them reduce their murder rate and to stop the flow of drugs across our borders. And as a mayor of a city that's strapped for finances, I began to wonder, well, that's really great, and I'm glad they're doing it. And I do want to put this in right context. I have no problem with those expenditures. I think Secretary Kerry yesterday was very forceful in his need to make sure that the State Department was funded and we have adequate funding to fight whatever fights are coming our way. I simply began to opine about, well, what happens, why are we actually doing that? We're doing that so that we keep the homeland safe. And what if we haven't closed the circle? In other words, there's a loop that has not been reconnected. So that, for example, in Medellin, Colombia, if we don't get the drugs and they're coming through the I-10 corridor or they're coming down the I-95 corridor, who's supposed to be over here receiving that and making sure that the homeland is safe? The same thing, I think, is painfully evident now with Boston, Istanbul, Paris, Orlando, et cetera, et cetera. We are
Brussels.
And we are vulnerable to a soft target attack on terrorism. And what occurs to me, and it should be obvious to everybody, if you go back and look at the tape of the immediate aftermath on Orlando, who were the people there doing the hard work? Now, our friends from the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, the US Marshals were there, but they were mostly there originally in support, and then they took over after. And their presence, by the way, on the ground is welcome, and they're from the community. So these federal officials, even though it sounds like they're from Washington, they live in our community. But primarily, it is the local law enforcement that has to respond. It's the EMS that has to respond. It's the emergency medical services in the hospital, the trauma units that have to respond. And what I'm beginning to say is that we're not adequately equipped yet, and we're not as robust as we need to be. I think that there are, let me just call out some numbers here. I may get this a little bit wrong. There are about 1.3 million active military personnel. The budget for the Defense Department is either $1 trillion or in the trillions. We have about 800,000 police officers. 500,000 would be on active duty, but only about 4,000 of them are in what we call joint terrorism task force activities, where they're coordinating with the federal, state, and local authorities. And it's not enough if we're going to have to protect ourselves for what we think is coming our way. And so I would just posit the notion that when we're overseas and we're fighting, and sometimes we're contracting with private contractors to help us, and we're doing nation building over there, we need to do that here so that we can completely close the circle on security and protecting the homeland. And if that is true, we have to redirect resources, or we have to get new resources, because that's all about manpower. It's about money, it's about technology, it's about strategy, and then it's about execution. And that's the theory behind the notion that we have become the tip of the spear, and we're now the nation's counterterrorism fighting force.
Congresswoman, is this a problem that existed over the history of after 9/11? DHS is created. Obviously, they know there's a local law enforcement component. Has this weakness been there, or is this new now that we're seeing a different kind of threats and attacks?
Well, I think it's been there, but it's now on steroids. I mean, it's geometrically harder than it was. But we did recognize it at the time. Let me say a couple things. First of all, about Mitch. Mitch is the incoming president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. This is a big deal, and it's a big credit to him and New Orleans, but it's also great for all the rest of us because he sees this across the whole country. It's not just about one city, and it isn't just about one city. It could be any city. So I'm delighted that we have adopted each other and that the Wilson Center, which is focused mostly internationally, is going to be working with him and with the Conference of Mayors on better strategies. And that's what we're talking about, is better strategies. Yes, we recognized it at the time. I remember I was then in Congress, and in my district in part of Los Angeles, there was a string of gas station robberies, and some astute police officer from the Torrance PD. Torrance is a city of about 35,000 people in my former district, said, something must be going on, got a warrant, searched the house if they'd picked up one of the guys, and guess what? Found materials casing military recruiting centers, synagogues, and some weapons. Guess what? It's an early terror cell trying. I don't think some of the current folks inspiring people were around back in the day, but these were Muslims who were converted in Folsom State Prison, which was a standard operating procedure at the time, and there was the ringleader, and then these other guys were going to attack these sites. So that would never have been discovered but for an astute police officer. And Mitch is absolutely right that the eyes and ears in communities are not the FBI, not to disparage the FBI, but I think there are 40,000 last time I looked, FBI agents in the country, and obviously many more cops on the beat, plus the cops are the ones who do and should build relationships with the community and be tipped off. Not in every case. Cops can do better, communities can do better too, but they're the ones to be tipped off. The goal here is not to wait for the attack and then respond. The goal is to prevent or disrupt the attack, and we've been fairly successful doing that. Just a couple of other things. I am one of the godmothers of the Homeland Security Department. I was there when the Bush administration proposed it. It was a gigantic idea, 22 departments and agencies put under one roof. They're still not under one roof, but changing cultures and getting it to work well is a work in progress, but it's doing better. But one of the things we did early on was to not only create these joint terrorism task forces, that was an FBI initiative, but to create fusion centers, right, which, again, are local, and they fuse intelligence from different levels of government, local, state, and federal. But we also had set up a group of cops inside the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington who were helpful in preparing the intelligence information for cops. I mean, they were user-friendly. They understand the language that cops speak, and with their help, the information was much more useful. I'll give one example of that. There was ricin was discovered. Ricin is an incredibly toxic poison in a hotel room in Las Vegas. And the fear was that this was and it turned out not to be this. I'm not sure if the plot was foiled and it never was going to be this, or I just don't remember the facts. But this ricin, tiny microscopic amount of ricin, was discovered in the hotel room. And so a bulletin went out from the National Counterterrorism Center in Washington to many police departments around the country. Problem was, they didn't describe what ricin looks like. And so what use is that bulletin? These cops who now work in Washington on a kind of rotating basis, they're detailed from police departments, are very helpful in making sure that the information communicated to local police departments is useful.
Mr. Miller, let me ask you about what seems to be this change in profile, which is, for a long time we talked about bombs and bomb making, and that was the worry that Al-Qaeda was going to detonate a big bomb in one of these big events of the kind that happened in New Orleans. But now we see self-radicalization. In the last 2 mass shootings that are terror-related in the United States, they've been AR-15 style weapons. So it's a single person. There's no word from headquarters in either. Does that change the challenge for you? Change, and maybe in an odd way give you an argument, which is to say that law enforcement has to be in these communities, has to be a part of on the ground to deter these kinds of attacks in a way that's different, because when you were building bombs, there's a signature to bomb making, and it's a little bit more of a production than a single person watching YouTube videos that gets self-radicalized.
I think the answer to that is yes, and the consequence then is you need 2 things. You need more technology. You have to be able to see and hear better within the bounds of civil liberties. And then you actually have to have boots on the ground. And you know what's interesting, the convergence that I'm trying to communicate is that it is the police officer, the same guy that responds to the shooting in the park. We had one the other day, a couple of months ago in New Orleans, where there were 300 or 400 kids in a park having a party, and it was a jam session, and 2 gangs decided to have their beef, and they opened fire, and they hit 23 people. 23 people. Mother's Day, 2 years ago, same thing, same beef, strafed the crowd. Now those police officers that are responding to that event, even though the impetus was street crime and a local beef, is the same if a lone gunman who's self-radicalized decides, well, I don't even have to go into a nightclub. I can just walk into a Mardi Gras parade, you know, and do the same thing. And so I'm just trying to make the point that police officers now have to be trained differently, and we need more of them. Now, the best thing, in my mind, one of the best things Congress did was pay for 100,000 police officers that went on the streets. They also, with the Homeland Security grants within the Department of Homeland Security, that was helpful, except they've now cut the funding for that dramatically. They've cut the funding for the COPS program, and the theory back then was, we can't do everything. The locals have to take care of this. This is a local problem. Well, I think Orlando put that lie to rest. This is not a local problem. This is a national problem, and it is about protecting the homeland. And so instead of going to create a whole new fighting force, you have a fighting force there. If you add to it, if you train it, and by the way, it could be federal employees. You could beef up, for example, the Homeland Security guys, or FBI, DEA, U.S. Marshal. You could, all those folks beefed up, but targeted, could work a little bit better and more closely to see how to, as Jane said, you want to stop the attack. Right. You know, the response is important too, being able to get there fast and take everybody and make sure that you can care for them, but you want to prevent. And we need more people, and we need more technology to do it.
I'd just add a couple things to that. The local force is not just cops, great as they are. It's also the public. This See Something, Say Something campaign may be a hokey little title, but it matters. The bomb that was going to go off in the car in Times Square, if anyone remembers that, about 3 or 4 years ago, was spotted, the smoke from the bomb, by a pedestrian walking by. I think it was by a street vendor, actually, yep, exactly. in Times Square. There's somebody who saw something and said something and foiled a plot that could have killed hundreds of people in Times Square. So all this stuff has to be coordinated. Right. Just a couple things more, Mitch. We've made some mistakes. I mean, federal grants are useful. The way the grants, they were called, I forget what it stands for, UASI grants for a while. Right. And what happened, unfortunately, was senators and members of Congress from big states got all the money. And while you can say, okay, New York and LA are bigger targets maybe than New Orleans, not necessarily. I mean, this should have been looked at I think in a more granular way. But the other thing the other mistake, I would say, was somebody got the bright idea that surplus war equipment like tanks ought to go to cities. And think Ferguson. The police department in that horrible incident rolled out the tanks against the people on the streets in Ferguson, and that was a mistake, a massive mistake. And I don't think that program exists anymore. I hope it doesn't.
Well, to a point, but let me mention this to you. I just came from the U.S. Conference of Mayors annual meeting in Indianapolis, and Buddy Dyer, who was the mayor of Orlando, came and spoke to us and gave us a chilling blow-by-blow story about what he had to do, where he was, how he responded, and he actually spoke to the issue that you just spoke about. And so I want to just parse that a little bit. It is probably not a good idea to send tanks down to small parishes or counties that are used inappropriately. But he made the point about the Bearcat. If you remember in watching this, they had what was called a Bearcat that actually busted holes
in the
into
wall.
the bathroom
Yeah.
walls. And because they had that piece of equipment, they were able to save 17 people. And that's when the shooter came out. They engaged him and they killed the shooter. And he was making the point that let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's really be smart. That when you have to have the appropriate equipment, but you don't need tanks.
Right.
I've got some people from New Orleans, and I don't want to scare you guys, but we regularly train for soft target impacts.
Yeah.
So when Mardi Gras is coming and we have the Super Bowl or we have the Jazz Fest, I'm going back home today to host the Essence Festival, which is a gathering, the largest gathering African-American business and music leaders in America. We'll have 250 to 300,000 people in the city. Before we do all of these events, we do training exercises where their bags left with bombs or other kinds of attacks that we think so that we can prepare for them. I'm just sending out a signal all across the country that we really don't have enough of what we need given what we think is coming our way. And I think we have to think smartly about the partnership between the federal, state, and local authorities to get that right.
And I'm agreeing with that. I just meant that there was some excessive reactions, Ferguson being one, and that maybe you're right, Mitch, that training is the answer, preparation and training. Also building trust, though, don't forget that, because some parent with a kid in the basement who's getting really weird needs to trust the police and tell them about the kid, or tell some kind of counselor or somebody, so that hopefully there can be intervention before the kid becomes violent, and there will never be any violation of law.
Which goes to the work the Department of Justice is doing with some consent decrees, where police officers have to be properly trained. They have to be properly supervised. There have to be consequences for bad behavior to restore that trust. Because if you don't have that trust, if the FBI's program is see something, say something, but the community's like, man, I'm not talking to the police, then the whole thing doesn't work.
What, Mayor, how do you get your head around, arms around the community that might be ripe for self-radicalization? I mean, because that's obviously a super sensitive topic, and law enforcement's interaction with that is obviously,
Well, that's a great question. This is like my grandma would say it's elbow grease, and as a politician would say it's retail politics. So, for example, on this whole big fight that we're having about what to call radical Islam or whatever the word people want to attach to it, that debate, I just want to conceptualize this. When that debate was raging, and it has been for some point in time, but I don't know, 6, 7, 8 months ago, I called together the leaders of the Muslim community in New Orleans, and I said, listen, I need to hear from you. First of all, I need you to know that you're part of this community. I said, but you need to hear what people are asking of you, and how are we going to talk about this? How are we going to deal with this? What responsibility do you have? How are you going to help really figure out, because you're closer to it necessarily than we are. And so we got them together with law enforcement so they could create, as Jane said, that level of trust. And they have been very, very helpful in leading that effort in the New Orleans area. Now, this has to be done writ large across the country, because otherwise this anti-Muslim sentiment that is being, that's percolating across the country can be laid to rest when that community shows up, leads, and is sitting in front of you and says, listen, that's not what the Muslim faith is about, and people getting to know them, understand them, and then them helping. But you got to do that, because it's not like you're the mayor of a city and there's a Muslim community. It's like they're two neighbors. One of them happens to be the mayor, and one of them happens to be a Muslim. And when you talk about it from that perspective, and they become the leaders in the community, they help in a way that I just think the police department can.
Two additions to that. Yeah, I strongly agree. One size doesn't fit all.
That's correct.
Every community is not the same. And therefore, having that discussion in every community or in many communities is the right thing to do. And let the people on the ground, the people whose trust you want, define the problem for you, and then be impressed, if that's the right word, or at least comfortable with how you, the elected official, are addressing the problem. And lots of Muslims are elected officials. Let's understand that too. There are Muslims in the United States Congress. That's one point. But it seems to me the second point is not every violent extremist is a Muslim. I mean, we have neo-Nazis and we have all kinds of left-wing something or others. And yes, the Oklahoma bomber was from New England with very extreme views. But so we can't just assume that this is a Muslim problem. It is most of the people who have been violent lately happen to be Muslims. That's true. But to demonize the whole population is totally wrong and unhelpful.
Well, but in this particular meeting, I had local imams sitting next to the FBI.
Right.
So here's the guy. Here's Jeff Soletz, the head of the ASAC of the FBI in New Orleans, and here's Imin Rafin Anik. And they're sitting there and say, okay, you guys, and they're building relationships. They're talking with each other. They're working really, really hard. And that's kind of the way you do it. But you have to do it community to community across the country. But there's got to be an open, inviting space to have that. And then you can actually get into, what politically correct issues that you argue about on your program. Or do you call it radical Islam? You say, well, Imam, if I called it radical Islam, how does that make you feel?
Exactly.
And he would say, it makes me feel like you're against me. And I said, well, what word would I use to be able to describe these radicalized young guys that are perverting Islam? He said to me, Monafiq. And I said, Monafiq? I don't understand. Spell that for me. And he spelled Monafiq for me. I said, what does it mean? Essentially, in English, it means two-faced. He said, you cannot kill in the name of Islam and be a true Muslim, is what he said to me. And so these kinds of discussions are only possible when you're having face-to-face discussions and trying to figure out what strategy works, from the language you use to the kind of information that's going to be provided to what they're going to do as leaders in the community. It's that kind of dialogue that helps. And when law enforcement is that close to the community, you have a much better chance of working as a one team as opposed to opposition. And I think that's got to be true, across the country.
And when Mitch Landrieu is your mayor, you have a better chance.
No, I think, listen, a lot of mayors around America, we're not really that ideal, even though we're a bipartisan organization. We have Republican mayors and Democratic mayors. Actually, our president this year is from Oklahoma City. He's a Republican. His name is Mick Cornett. Mayors are much steadier about this issue than what is reflected on the programs on Sunday from the folks that are talking on the thing. And we know, because we're in the communities, that we touch human beings every day. It's not a distant discussion. Our discussion across, paper, you're physically touching another human being and you're seeing their humanity, and it brings another dimension to the development of a strategy.
And the state and local level mostly have bipartisan office holders who try to solve problems. The United States Congress, my former employer, is totally dysfunctional because the goal is not to solve the problem, but blame the other guy for not solving the problem so that you can cut the 30-second ad and get yourself reelected.
So given that dysfunction, how's the mayor going to get more money?
Congress, actually, my sense is there's not going to be a budget again this year. We're going to have a continuing resolution from last year. My hope would be that the next president will want to work with Congress much more closely and try to figure out strategies. I mean, any president who doesn't keep our homeland safe is not a good president. Let's just start there.
It also seems there's we've snapped into a pattern of reaction to any of these attacks, whether it's in Brussels, San Bernardino, Orlando, Paris, even though they're all quite different. But the political reaction, at least at the national level, is what can we do about ISIS? And so we talk about Fallujah and Raqqa and that kind of stuff. And that's, of course, important. And the narrative of ISIS as a moving threat is important to the self-radicalization. But it's strange to me that somebody doesn't say, it's about this contact with imams in the community, that we just don't, we're always snapping over to what's happening overseas and not kind of immediately bringing up these kinds of issues.
Well, just, first of all, I thought Orlando's response was fabulous. First of all, the first responders were
great.
Amazing. And the FBI augmented what they could do, but they were great. The community came together. There was no finger pointing. And this wasn't just a Muslim issue, although this guy had pledged allegiance to ISIL at the end. This was also an LGBT issue, and the community embraced that. And I just saw that the nightclub, which is now closed, or the employees of the nightclub held some big party in the community to try to heal. And beautiful thing. So, check. But also, when this happened, some of the U.S. Muslim organization like CAIR, C-A-I-R, I forget what it stands for, had somebody up on the tubes, condemning the violence. So I do think in the U.S., where we have much more assimilated Muslim communities, that we do better than, for example, Europe. And by the way, foreign fighters are pre-positioned in Europe. Nobody missed the horrific attacks in Istanbul yesterday. They're soft targets. And I think while there's all this distraction with Brexit, that could be a big opportunity for another attack in the next few weeks. And airports, I was just in Europe. There's much more security in European airports, but there's no such thing as 100% security.
Well, maybe, look, I mean, I would rely on Jane for advice about Congress, but there just seems some things that seem just so nonsensical to me, that they're ideas that are so easy to put together. They're right there, ready to kiss. It seems to me that you have a lot of conservatives and Republicans, particularly in Congress, that are talking about upending the sequester to make sure that if we don't do anything else in this country, we fund defense of the country. I think everybody seems to, on the Republican side, to be for that. They're also say, don't talk about guns. Let's talk about getting guns out of the hands of criminals, which essentially means you need more police officers on the street. And if I'm correct in saying that police officers, and by the way, our military men and women are being cross-trained too, not just to fight on the battlefield, but actually to help rebuild cities.
And there are Muslims in our military.
Yeah, it seems to me that all of these things are converging. Now, Secretary Kerry was here yesterday, and people asked him about taking out Assad. And let's just assume the president changed his mind and said to Secretary Kerry, go get him. Nobody would ask, how much is it going to cost? That question just would not come up. And then we would spend whatever we had to spend. And so I just don't understand why, when it comes back to protecting the homeland, that what you then began to hear from congressmen, and you hear it from Democrats and Republicans, oh, that's a local issue. Well, I just remember watching the TV programs, the first two people that were on TV talking about the Orlando thing with his two United States senators from Florida, talking about why it was an international event. But it happened on the street, in a city, in a neighborhood, on the street where you live. I think that was part of a song that came from one of the great Broadway shows. And so I don't understand where this disconnect is between the idea of this being an international event and the funding and pushing off as though that's not ours, it's yours, when we all know it's ours. And I just don't understand the way Congress processes solving problems. I just don't get it.
That's an oxymoron, processing something.
No, it's not necessarily true, but they have to get to there has to be some integrity in thinking and funding. And I don't really know how to get them to say, well, it makes a lot of sense. We'll give you $20 billion more. And the money, some of the money's gone to UASI, some of the money's gone to FBI, some of the money's gone to fund new cops, some of the money's gone to technology. Somebody, a General Petraeus, can give me a framework to actually secure the streets of America in a better way. You can't always get rid of the risk, but you can, like levee protection, you can have a risk reduction strategy as it relates to public safety.
Right.
So what is we know, yes, dysfunction in Congress, but are there other things that people don't, is it, lobbyists? Is it big, defense contractors? Why is it that the conversation doesn't get to the level?
Again, I think the business model of Congress is broken. Not everybody in Congress is broken. There's some very capable people in both parties who probably take medicine on a daily basis because it's so frustrating there. But solving problems is not what Congress does. If you solve problems, you have to work with other people who are not in your party or not in the segment of your party, and then you get a primary challenge. And oops, if you want to stay elected, you don't do that. Look at this insane fight on no fly, no buy. This teeny-weeny little initiative to say if you are on the no-fly list because you're a suspected terrorist, you can't buy a gun. Does anybody here disagree with that proposition? I wouldn't think so. So my very good friend, not in my party, but she is a dear friend of mine, Susan Collins from Maine, is being enormously courageous as a Republican trying to push this thing in the Senate. Well, she got a vote last week that at least meant that the bill is not dead. You didn't need 60 votes for it not to be dead. But is it going to come up this week? Probably not. The House is adjourned for another week after the sit-in that John Lewis had. And so want my prediction? There won't be any action on this thing. And if we can't do that, how in the world can we provide some money for the very sensible ideas you have, Mitch?
May I ask you a question about?
Yes,
Can you explain? This is just something I don't know enough about the rules of Congress, but there was something that somebody said to me was called the Hastert rule.
Oh, yeah.
that reflects what bills get to the floor and how. Is that in place now? And can you
Well,
explain
it's
how
not
that
a
works
rule.
to me?
It's fortunately an
that?
informal rule. When Hastert was the Speaker of the House, he said he wouldn't put anything on the House floor that a majority of his party didn't support. That's what the Hastert rule is.
That means
So-
a quarter. In this instance, a quarter of the House.
No. It's a majority of the Republicans in the House. The Republicans are in charge in both bodies. So if Paul Ryan is following the Hastert rule, and I forget how many Republicans there are, if there are 240 Republicans, it means 121 Republicans have to support it before it goes on the floor. And the House has rules. It has a rules committee that decides on the time for debate and which amendments are in order. The Senate doesn't have that. The Senate has a filibuster procedure. But the Rules Committee has a huge disparity between the majority members and the minority members, so it rubber stamps whatever the Speaker of the House
the philosophical justification for that rule is what? Or the political
wants.
justification?
Is survival by the Speaker.
Yeah.
He wants a majority, or she wants a majority of the caucus to support her.
And if you look at the times that it's been broken on debt ceiling or government funding measures, those have been the case that then is used to get speakers out like John Boehner.
I don't think the American public understands this. I think the American public, to the extent that they work through any civics, what are they, 435 members in the House, right?
Correct.
So they think that they've elected 435 members, and somebody every day throws a jump ball. What do you think about abortion? What do you think about capital punishment? What do you think about war and peace? What do you think about whatever? Let's have a debate about it. Somebody put up an idea how to fix it. We're all going to vote, and 50% plus one, the majority of the country represented by these people in a republic wins. And that's really not what happens. But I think what you just told me was that, let's just say the House is split almost evenly. Whoever's got a little bit more gets to run the chicken coop. And they have to stay in power. And in order to stay in power, at least half, which is 1/4 of the people, and since they're congressmen, they all represent an equal number. So
Right.
1/4 of the country gets to determine whether or not we even get to have a debate about an issue.
That's right.
Now I don't understand.
But you don't have that quite right, Mitch. I mean, people sitting in this audience want Congress to function. People who vote in primaries in some congressional districts, some of them want to stop the federal government from doing almost anything. That's one. And two, feel they own their member of Congress, whom they elected, and want that person to be a single issue person focused on pick an issue.
But I wonder if in this case this is really, that dysfunction that you all have described certainly exists, but there is another rule in politics, which is that when something bad happens, people rush for a solution, and they sometimes throw money at it. So in the wake of San Bernardino and Orlando, you could have imagined a situation where both parties get into a foot race to see who can react faster, whether that and we saw it on No Fly, No Buy, though, as you said, Congresswoman, it didn't get anywhere. But in this case, I feel like something else is at play for why the kinds of solutions you're offering aren't at least a little bit more a part of the conversation, because it would allow lawmakers to say, I have a solution, or I'm behind a solution, or the solution they seem to run to is, particularly on the Republican side, is just more kinetic action in the fight against ISIS over there. And so that's why I'm puzzled about why somebody hasn't decided, if for no other reason, then it would allow them to distinguish themselves, to say, you know what, we need to spend less money over there and more money on the streets, because that's where this self-radicalization
or both. I'm not arguing. Listen, I'm not an isolationist. I think Secretary Kerry was exactly right. I think we need to be robust. I think we need to be aggressive. I think we have to do whatever we have to do thoughtfully, strategically, to protect ourselves on the other side of the water. I'm just saying, but you have to, it's a full circle fighting force. They're actually fighting the same fight. And even though some are hired by local authorities and some are hired by the federal government, it's essentially one fight now.
I'm totally agreeing with you. I'm just saying I have a pretty up close and personal idea of how Congress doesn't work on this issue. And you are right that the sequester, I think you all know what that is. That was a really brain-dead idea that Congress had about 5 years ago to set up this draconian system where no money could be spent unless certain thresholds were met. This was after a very good idea, Simpson-Bowles, which was designed to put all the big issues on the table and solve them at once, was rejected. At any rate, the sequester, no one ever thought the sequester would pass. Well, guess what? It did, and it now constrains spending both on defense and domestically, which is hurting everybody. It's certainly hurting our country. But at any rate, nobody wants to add money to anything, and so if you put additional money here, you have to take it away from there. The only place that doesn't happen is in something called the OCO account, Overseas Contingency Operations. And that's how we're funding our wars. And P.S., we haven't even authorized the war that we're fighting in the Middle East. If any of you missed this movie, the justification for the war is the 2001 authorization to use military force, which everyone but one person in Congress voted for, in Afghanistan against the people who attacked us on 9/11. Now, you could kind of argue that the great-great-grandfathers of ISIL were those people who attacked us on 9/11, but ISIL is not the only terror organization we're fighting, and it's, it is Congress, again, ducking responsibility, and nobody wants to pass a new authorization because then they own the problem. They'd much rather blame Obama for doing the wrong thing. It is a very cynical game, and I'm sorry if I sound so depressed. I mean, I'm in beautiful Aspen, but I've watched it really, really closely for many years, and we need a way out. And what's that way? One, a president who engages much more closely with Congress. Obama started to do it and then dropped it. Think Lyndon Johnson. That's one. And then we need all of you to be mad as hell and make your members solve problems.
Let's have some questions in which you can express your anger if you'd like. But before we turn to questions, let me just ask, so we don't end on such a depressing note.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I love my grandchildren.
And apple pie is tasty. But let's see if you can both quickly combine in a, so perhaps it relies on a president, but what does the mayor need to do? Does he need to call somebody in Congress and say, let's get a conversation going so we can get some of this money coming? Does he need to testify in front of the?
Yeah. Well, he's got a new bully pulpit that's great, the Conference of Mayors. I mean, wouldn't it be great if, do it strategically. You don't need every mayor in America, but you need the mayors who the obstructionists will listen to do a big fly-in, and don't just bring the mayor, bring the big business leaders and whoever else has a megaphone in that district to basically sit in all these offices, make a big deal out of it, demanding action to, figure out what the list is. That would get real attention, and then stay at it.
Well, I think we have a couple of things to do. First of all, we got to take care of our own business and make sure that the police officers that we have are appropriately trained and that we're not wasting any money and that we have a targeted strategy. So you're exactly right. You wouldn't want to go to Congress and say, give me $100 billion and then get out of my way and we'll do whatever and spread it all and sprinkle it like fairy dust across the country. You want to really come with a really clear, thoughtful, strategic plan. Now, Jane raises a really significant issue. If it's a lone wolf, they may come to New Orleans. They may just as soon go to Boone, Iowa. To the July 4th fair. And so I think we've got to be smart about that. And then subsequently, we actually have to go to Congress and lobby them because I think that we have to convince them that our cause is just and it's right and it makes sense. But the reason I was laughing about the sequester because God's got a great sense of humor. All right, they proposed this idea. It was so stupid. They did it because it was so stupid nobody would be for it. And then they voted for it. And I think that's funny. I just think that's not a great way to make public policy. They didn't actually vote for it. They didn't vote against it.
They didn't vote against it. It took effect if nobody acted.
All right. Do we have a question in the House?
Yes.
Here we have one. A hand is raised, and a microphone will come to you. There we go. And then if you could stand so that we could see you in the lights.
Well, good morning. My name is Perry Kuhn. I live in California, Coronado, California. You had said there's a term that the imam gave you. Can you give us that term again and spell it? And the second question is, if that does exist, why don't we see that in the media today?
Well, the truth is that even though he told me that, I think that I don't have the same concern about the term radical Islam. You might want to ask you folks who you're working with whether that affects them or not. I have no problem using that term. I think it's a clear, concise way to describe what it is that we're doing, but it only points out that the people that we're trying to work with, many of them feel that term offensive. His other term it's munafiq. I don't know how to spell it. I think it's M-U-N-I-F-I-Q. But he translated that to me as meaning, deceptive, two-faced, trying to be one thing and being another, and then explained to me very succinctly, he said, you cannot kill in the name of Islam and be a true Muslim. And I just thought that was just it was just something really heartfelt that he said to me, and he's been very helpful. Munafiq.
Here we have one over here.
I am Jake Goldman from Kansas City. In 2014, 3 people were killed at the local Jewish community center in Overland Park, Kansas, by a neo-Nazi who professed his hate towards Jewish people. In the months and now years after the tragedy, the woman who lost her father and son, Mindy Corcoran, has focused her intention on building a community in which we have a strong presence of interfaith relationships. She did this by her foundation, Faith Always Wins, and then an event called 7 Days, Make a Ripple, Change the World, with the whole goal of bringing a large group of people, like I said. And that's what I believe. It's an effort to allow people of different faiths to talk, because that's what I believe we lack, is that dialogue. So, Mayor, or have you seen any change in your community after working with the leader, and what has been done in New Orleans to bring people of all faiths together?
Great question. By the way, in case anybody's wondering, there have been about 550 people killed on the streets of America since Orlando from just gun violence. And we don't seem to talk a lot about that. But in this particular instance, as Jane alluded to, after the Orlando incident, people from around America really rallied. In New Orleans, we had a number of services, and at that service, it was unbelievable. We had 2 of the local rabbis who were leaders in our community were there. The Sikh religion was represented, the Hindu religion was represented. We had a number of imams there. The Catholic, the Archbishop sent folks, and we had an ecumenical prayer service, right? That really kind of everybody wrapped their arms around everybody to talk about why this was just a humanitarian crisis. And you continue to do that all the time. I can't tell you how devastating it is and how negatively impacted to have to go to a murder site or a shooting site, and then for the community to have to heal. Now, we're resilient, and the response in Orlando was incredible. The response is in Boston, and it brings us together as a community, but it's not really an issue that you want to really resolve. But it really takes everybody physically coming together and seeing each other and recommitting that you're not going to get pulled apart by the angry, discussions on the airwave, and leaders really kind of turning out and protecting each other when all the craziness goes on, and keeping steady, focused leadership, right, as you move forward together, to not pulling people apart. If you don't have that kind of cohesion in your neighborhood, you need to build it, and you can do it. People will be open to it.
All right, another question. Here we have one here in the front, and I think this might be our last one. And if you wouldn't mind standing, just because it's...
I wanted to dissect a little bit the House, and let's take the no-fly, no-buy.
Yeah.
Is there a public record of the representatives that vote not to allow this to come to the floor?
Oh yeah, this is going on in the Senate. The House hasn't even, get this, taken up any legislation in the wake of Orlando. And what happened last week was John Lewis, the celebrated civil rights leader, who is a senior congressman from Georgia, staged a sit-in on the House floor to protest the fact that Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House and the leader of the Republicans, wouldn't even, yeah. Well, but I'm going to tell you what happened. So what happened was Ryan adjourned the House. House is out of session. In the Senate, there were several votes, and you can see who voted how. There were 2 Republican bills and 2 Democratic bills that were voted on. They all lost. They didn't get, the Senate, because of the filibuster, requires 60 votes to put to pass a bill. Then Collins came up with this compromise that she had been working on, which has bipartisan support, strong support. Tim Kaine, for example, a senator from Virginia, Democrat, is strongly supportive of what she's doing. And so this was offered as a bipartisan compromise. And Mitch McConnell, who's the majority leader of the Senate, let her have a vote, not to pass the bill, but to, I can't remember right this minute what the procedure was in the Senate, where you only need 50 votes. And she got 52, and there is a public record of who voted for and against that. And yes, you can look at it, and yes, I mean, it is certainly, there were very few Republicans, but there were some. I think there are 45 Democrats, so there had to be 7 Republicans who voted for her bill, including her. And maybe it will come up again. The next hurdle will be there, and it will come up again. But this would be, if you want to do something on this subject, pressing the Senate to act would be very, very useful, because if they act, then there'll be more pressure on the House to act.
Well, my idea is that if the obstructionists, I'm going back to the House, were publicized, because there's overwhelming national support for no fly, no buy. It's a no-brainer.
Right.
If the obstructionists were publicized in a very open way in all of our big newspapers, don't you think we would begin to get some traction with their own constituents coming back and saying,
My answer is go after the senators first. You want this to pass the Senate. I'm not arguing with your premise, but I think there's the shortcut is do the Senate first. Mitch,
I want to take a crack at that just to try to, because I do think there is a misalignment, and Jane spoke about this earlier. Congressmen respond to the constituents in their district. They're not going to, they will not respond, or they will not be pressured by, let's say, the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or the Chicago Tribune. And so there seems in this country, and maybe it's reapportionment, I don't quite know what it is. I can just observe, if you were doing a forensic audit of why this corporation doesn't work, there's a misalignment between the mayors in America and who votes for us, and then who votes for the congressman. And although they kind of a little bit could be the same people, the mix of people that votes for the congressman, if they don't put them under pressure, it's no big deal. And so that's why I just find, I know that I was probably a little bit wrong, but I'm not that far off on my math. If 120 congressmen represent, I don't know what a congressional district is, 765,000. So 120 times 765,000, whoever's fast enough here to do that math. That number of people in America, ostensibly because they're electing their congressmen, are dictating whether or not we actually have a chance to have an argument on the House floor. See, we're not even having a debate. This is before it even actually gets on the House floor for a debate. So all of and this is what really is interesting to me, for all of these folks that are yelling about, we're too sensitive, we're too politically correct, we won't even call each other names. They won't even have a discussion about a tough issue. And I think America doesn't really fully understand that. I do think the country would then say, well, those rules don't seem to make a lot of sense. Right. You're not even throwing the ball up for a jump ball. Even when you're watching David Cameron on TV right now about this whole Brexit thing, they actually sit there in a room and argue with each other. They have a debate. They actually talk about the issues. And then there is some kind of resolution. The answer is either yes or no, or I'll come back and I'll talk to you tomorrow. They're not in a place where, no, we can't talk. And I do think the American public will get upset about that, irrespective of the specifics of the districts. And I think we have to keep putting more pressure on them, and hopefully, something will break in the next couple
But as John Lewis said, and he was very compelling last week, I thought, how many more mothers have to lose their children for this to matter?
All right, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the two of you.
But we love our children.